Kirsch, our presenter this evening, spent over 4 years researching and writing the story of her family from the Axis side of World War II in Latvia, occupied Poland, and Germany. Her book, Flight of Remembrance, was an award-winning finalist in the narrative nonfiction category of the 2012 USA Best Book Awards. In the past 7 years, she has spoken at venues including libraries, museums, retirement communities, and lifelong learning institutes in 9 states. Her presentations provide an opportunity to gain a new perspective on World War II and to ensure that lessons and memories from the war are preserved for posterity. Marina lives in Kensington, New Hampshire. She is a New Hampshire Humanities to Go speaker and a member and officer with advanced certification in Toastmasters International, a worldwide organization that helps members gain confidence in public speaking and leadership. Please help me welcome our presenter, Marina Kirsch.
Thank you, Rebecca. Is there value in stories told from both sides of a world conflict, or only in those told from the side of the victors, especially if they vanquished a brutal regime that directly or indirectly caused the death of 50 to 70 million people worldwide? Can you fathom that? I can't. So I did some math. If you buried 5 people a day, it would take you more than 27,000 years to bury 50 million. It would take you more than 38,000 years to bury 70 million. World War II was a cataclysm without precedent. It took the lives, the hopes, the dreams of countless millions. My family's story, as recorded in Flight of Remembrance, is from the Axis side of the war, and it includes 2 German veterans. The main protagonists, my parents. Rolf Dutzmann, a Latvian aeronautical engineering student, and Lila Wasul, the young woman that he met in 1940 Berlin. In 2004, I encountered a comment from someone who said, "But it's a story about Nazis." And yes, I suppose I expected that coming from someone, even though no one on either side of my family joined the Nazi Party or supported Hitler. I did ponder, however, whether the timing would ever be right for a story about German people during World War II. But I came to realize that there is therapeutic potential in a story that gives a face and a name to the enemy without denying or burying the past. My family's story is one of hope and love and dreams. I want to thank the Kingston Community Library for hosting me here, and many thanks to Rebecca for all the communications and preparations that brought us to this day. I also feel very privileged to be able to present for New Hampshire Humanities, and I hope that all of you will support their efforts to provide quality programming around the Granite State. My presentations have 3 main objectives, and those have developed out of feedback to my book and my presentations. The first one is to illustrate how love and dreams supported by faith can overcome despair and help people to survive adversity. Our dreams of today, after all, are the hope for tomorrow. The second objective is to share with you a little bit of what it was like for people to live through war waged on home soil. Have you ever experienced that? No. It's never happened here in the US other than during the Civil War. And the third objective is to help others identify stories from their own past that are valuable, and especially, too, to help people whose past has been lost in parts of Germany or Poland or other parts of Europe. Some of them have been able to recover lost parts of their family's story through the story that I tell. Now I'd like to ask first whether there are any World War II veterans present. And I know you all look really young, so I doubt that there are, but I always ask, do we have any World War II veterans present? Some of them have surprised me with how young they look. What about spouses of World War II veterans? Are there any in our audience? Okay, now, how many of you had family members, ancestors, who served in World War II on either side of the war? All right, we have quite a few. And the last question, because people who were in Europe and Russia and Ukraine and other places during the war often are drawn to my presentations, is there anybody here that was in a part of the world where the war was fought? That would include Europe, Russia, Ukraine, Philippines, Japan. Anybody? How about ancestors of any of you? Yes, we have some. Okay, we have some. Which countries were they in?
Hawaii. My father was in Hawaii.
Hawaii?
The Netherlands.
Netherlands? There were a couple of other hands up that I saw. Okay, hold those stories. I'm delighted. We'll have some things to talk about. At the end, there will be more time for discussion and Q&A. I'd like now to tell you my family story in a nutshell, as shown on the cover of my book. The guy in the helmet, my father Rolf, after he fled Latvia in 1939 in advance of the first Soviet takeover. He is dismayed now to find himself not only in Germany, but drafted into the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. The swastika on his helmet, I debated that, but it is the only element on my cover that shows it's a book from the other side of the war, and I felt that that was necessary. My parents, Rolf and Lilo, wedding day, November 1944. The little guy up top, my older brother Ingo, age 2, in post-war Germany. Now, flying in from the top right, a little icon, which is an illustration that I did of my father Rolf flying a pre-World War II Latvian glider. That little icon represents two things. First of all, my father's overarching goal in life, to further the field of aeronautical engineering. It was his passion. But secondly, it also represents my quest to gain a higher and a wider perspective on World War II through the researching, the writing, and now the presenting of my family's story. And I want to thank all of you for being here, because through people like you, I also am able to broaden my understanding of what happened during that time period. And finally, the award emblem from the USA Best Book Awards in 2012. This was in the narrative nonfiction category. I designed the book myself. I did have professional editors, but I was really overwhelmed and quite surprised, very pleasantly surprised, to receive that award. How many of you have heard of a book entitled Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl? A few of you have. That book is on my suggested reading list for the World War II time period, and I will send it to you if you sign up on the mailing list that's going around with your email address. Viktor Frankl was a Viennese Jew who suffered through the concentration camp system in Germany and occupied Poland. He survived. He wrote in this book, "There is nothing that would so enable one to survive even the worst of circumstances than knowing that there is a meaning in one's life." After the war, he established logotherapy, the third Viennese school of psychotherapy, which is focused on finding meaning in life. Frankl found meaning even at Auschwitz. For my parents and grandparents, love and dream, supported by faith, helped them to not only overcome despair, but it aided their survival and helped them to visualize a life beyond the cataclysm. Let's time travel now. We are back in 1924 Latvia. My father, Rolf, is a little boy second from left, with his mother, Maria, his little sister, Ruth, and his father, Ernst, in Latvian military uniform. Ernst had a dream too. His dream from boyhood, sitting on the hillside of his family's farm, was always the same. He looked out at a sliver of the Baltic Sea on the horizon, saw the ships going back and forth. He wanted to be captain of a ship bound for America. But that was not going to happen during World War II. Rolf had had a passion for aeronautical engineering since a very young age. Like millions of young people in the 1920s and 30s, he wanted to be part of the new field of aeronautical engineering. And by this time, he's 14, and he's been building model gliders for years from German and American magazines. By age 18, he's been winning national Latvian awards for his gliders. He's also building his first full-size manned glider and his first full-sized motorized plane. Here he is flying that glider. Now, that glider was constructed by a group of young men called the Izargs, and Rolf was a member of that group. They were the closest thing that Latvia had to a National Guard between the two world wars, but were completely, permanently disbanded after the Soviet takeover. Now, you'll see something interesting about this photograph and about what I'm wearing. My grandmother Maria was wearing the same dress in 1935 that I have on. She hand-tailored it and embroidered it in the early 1930s. It's silk crepe. The embroidery design has been identified by a costume museum in Riga as an authentic Latvian design. She changed it to fit me when I was a teenager, and miraculously, it still fits. The jewelry I'm wearing is called a Posen brooch. It is from the southwestern part of Latvia where the family lived. And these were worn by women as a sign of the family's wealth. So if you had 4 or 5 of them, you might consider wearing them all at one time. Quite a few beautiful examples of my grandmother's needlework have survived from World War II, but also from the time period beyond. We also have letters, documents, memorabilia, and photographs. We have an incredible archive of photographs. I used 132 of them in the book. But perhaps the most precious thing of all was a family history written by my parents, Rolf and Lilo, in the early 1990s. When I had that in my hands, I knew what a treasure my family's story is, and I knew I wanted to share it in some way. What treasures do you have in your past or in your family's past? Love through those kinds of treasures, preserving them and sharing them, is a very, very precious thing, something that we all might consider. Which country, and I'd like to get some answers from you if you think you know, which country was most feared in Europe during World War II, and especially by people of German heritage or German descent? Would anyone like to venture a guess?
Russia?
Yes, Russia. Now, it was Soviet Union, right? However, no one called it that. They called it Russia. In Germany, it was Russland. It even sounds ominous. October of 1939, Rolf is studying aeronautical engineering. Finally, his dream is coming about at the University of Riga when an ominous phone call comes from his father, Ernst, urging him to come home immediately. Life for Rolf and family would never be the same again. Ernst, who was in the military, a major in the Latvian army, had caught wind of the fact that the Soviets were coming. A takeover was imminent. And for people like the Dutzmann family, who were of German heritage, and there were people of German heritage all over the face of Europe, a Soviet takeover was a very risky thing indeed. They were at greater risk for execution or deportation under a Soviet takeover. But the only country that would accept German people as refugees was Nazi Germany, already at war and already long under Hitler's control. Ernst especially was at great risk. He had served as a Tsarist Russian officer in World War I, then a Latvian officer between the two world wars, and finally, he was an outspoken anti-communist. To the Dutzmann family, verdict on Hitler and the Nazi regime was still out, but the verdict on the Stalin regime, they already knew what that was about. The Stalin regime had little or no respect for human life. They could have given in to all this. What would you do? But instead, their love for each other and their hopes and dreams for the future far beyond that war were what kept them going, kept them making decisions that would aid survival instead of giving in and capitulating to despair. They decided that they needed to flee Latvia. Rolf, with his mother Maria and sister Ernst, 1939, shortly before they, Ernst, and 2,000 other Baltic Germans from Latvia fled by ship. That was in December of 1939. And their fears were chillingly accurate. After the Soviet takeover, Latvian officers who had failed to flee were shot on the spot, and tens of thousands of Latvian citizens were executed or deported. Latvia experienced wave upon wave of tragedy, and not just Latvia, most of Eastern Europe. In 1942, the Holocaust in Latvia. The Nazi regime took over in Latvia and also Lithuania and Estonia. 75,000 Jews were murdered in Latvia alone. This photograph is from German military archives. And then, as we know, in 1945, another devastating takeover when the Soviets came back again and took over from the German troops. A map of December 1939 Northern Europe. It's been changing exponentially already by this time. In the light tan, Germany proper, which included East Prussia off to the right. In the darker tan, the countries that Germany had already annexed or taken over, including the former Austria, and here, half of the former Poland. In the red, the other half of Poland. Poland was brutally partitioned, the other half taken over by the Soviet Union. Two other countries involved in the family story in orange, Switzerland and Slovakia. Further north, the three Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They are perched like gems on the Baltic Sea, but just to the right is the bulk of the Soviet Union. They are in a very precarious position. I wanted to show you where the family lived. They lived on the Baltic Sea in a military enclave called Kara Osta, which was north of a larger city called Liepaja on the Baltic Sea. And that's where Ernst was head of a department in a munitions laboratory. When the family fled, they fled from the port city of Riga, which was also the capital, via a dotted line that you might have seen that went down to an island called Usedom in the Baltic Sea. That was part of Germany proper. And when they left the port city, they and the 2,000 other people on board became people without a home, people without a national identity, and people with no idea what their fate would be under the Nazi regime. And for Rolf and Ernst, the fear was that they would be immediately drafted. Well, that didn't happen, but their other worst fear did. They were sent eastward to occupied Poland. Here, Rolf is writing in his diary. He is apprehensive whether the regime will allow him to continue his aeronautical engineering education, or will they draft him right away? And his mother, Maria, at left, also pondering what the family's fate will be. Their immediate fate was they were accommodated in Posen in crude, unheated barracks. The food was equally dismal, and there was very little to do. They slept on the floor. That too didn't last long. From there, They were sent further eastward, from Posen to Litzmannstadt or Lodz. Look at how close they are getting to the Soviet threat, which for Ernst especially was of great concern. However, he couldn't find work there commensurate with his skills. He had very advanced skills in munitions in particular. The regime then sent the family to Berlin, where he was employed for a time. This is speaking of my grandfather now. And once the regime established what his skills truly were, they sent him north, back to that island of Usedom where the family had begun their German sojourn, and they drafted him as a major into the German army, the Wehrmacht. He trained there under Werner von Braun for V-2 rocket inspection. He worked at a place there called Peenemünde. How many of you have heard of Peenemünde? And how many have heard of Werner von Braun? Okay. But that installation was bombed. It was obviously no longer top secret in August of 1943. From there, the regime sent Ernst into the heart of Germany near a town called Nordhausen. There was a top secret underground installation there called Mittelwerk. That is where Ernst worked the last 14 months of the war as chief inspector of the V-2 rocket. Let's go now to the other side of the family story. My mother, Lilo. Full first name, Lieselotte. Last name, Wassel. With her parents, Gertrude and Walter. Lilo was born and raised in Berlin. She had a different perspective on Hitler and the Nazi regime than Rolf and family, who came in as latecomers from another country. She had seen some positive changes in the beginning, in the 1930s, but then as time went on, she saw sinister changes. Here she is age 10 or 11, and as she got a little older, she refused to join the League of German Girls, which was comparable to the Hitler Youth for boys, considering it to be sinister, fanatical, and atheistic. She wanted no part of it. No one in her family joined the Nazi Party or supported Hitler, nor anyone in Rolf's family. The year after Lilo graduated, however, every young person was forced to join the Nazi youth groups. Lilo here at age 19, she also had a dream. Her dream was for a harmonious, supportive, and loving home life and marriage, which did not exist in her growing up years because of her parents' rocky marriage and ultimate divorce. She is about to meet Rolf. When this photograph was taken, she was only weeks away from meeting the man who would complete her dream. Rolf, meanwhile, yes, he's in uniform, but he was allowed to finish his education first, which he did in Gdansk, which was a free city supposedly at one time, but by this time is enclosed by Nazi-occupied Poland. The same day that he received his diploma, his draft notice also came. He was drafted into the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. And at that time, there was a lot in the news about how things were going on the Eastern Front. Stories of unbelievable horror and savagery were filtering back from the snowbound vastness of the Russian countryside, and Rolf hoped he would never be sent there. He was fortunate in that early on in the war, he was put to work in a technical capacity, then glider flight training, and finally he opted to go for navigator training, thinking that would take up maybe another 2 years before he would be sent to the front or sent on combat missions. He never did fly any combat or bombing missions against the Allies. 1.4 million tons of bombs fell on Germany during World War II. 363 air raids over Berlin alone. Does anyone know, though, there were 2 cities in Germany that sustained even worse bombing in terms of intensity and the resulting firestorms? Does anyone know which 2 cities?
Dresden and Hamburg.
Yes, Dresden and Hamburg, absolutely. Yeah, very good. This is the ruined Dutzmann family home in Berlin after an Allied air raid, the exterior and the interior. Lilo's home was also destroyed, one floor at a time, until finally the top floor is gone, what was left of the roof and the ceilings and walls badly damaged, windows shattered, pipes burst, and water flowing into the apartment. She and her mother Gertrude could no longer live there. But the regime stated, no working person leaves Berlin. That was the rule. They wanted their people to stay put. But love and dreams, they persisted. And eventually, her mother Gertrude, who was a major mover and shaker in this family story, figured out a way that they would gain permission to move out of Berlin. And finally, in March of '44, they were allowed to move out. Now, Lilo's family members, all of them except for her mother, and this included her father, remained trapped in the eastern part of Germany that was under Soviet domination and later became East Germany, and she never saw them again. This is the only known photograph of my grandfather Ernst at the underground installation of Mittelwerk, only discovered after his death, along with some documents. I had to do a lot of research into his role during the war because Grandpa never talked about it. It was a journey of discovery that my father and I shared because my father was still alive. It was highly engaging to both of us. But imagine my horror when I found out that there was an immense, notorious slave labor camp outside the gates of the installation from which workers were drawn for the underground work and also for work in the entire area. It was a terrible camp. And I wondered what my grandfather's role there might have been. That camp was set up by the SS before my grandfather's arrival. He arrived in February of 1944. I found out through my research 200 Army and civilian engineers worked under him and 3 inmates. I was gratified to find out from post-war transcripts and books written by inmates that he befriended an inmate by the name of Yuri Benish and in fact saved his life on a number of occasions. When the SS wanted to interrogate him for sabotage, my grandfather would not let them. He told them that Yuri was essential to the war effort. And my grandfather also protected the other 2 inmates to the best of his ability, but under dire circumstances. The underground tunnels were a place where even engineers were executed if they did things wrong. This photograph I later donated along with documents from the wartime that we found among my grandfather's personal effects to the concentration camp memorial that now stands at the site of the former camp. And Yuri Benish survived. He wrote a book about his experiences after the war, including also post-war transcripts, and in it he describes his relationship with my grandfather. How sad that I didn't start writing and researching this book much earlier. I might have let my grandfather know that his friend from there survived. One of the underground tunnels as it looks today at the concentration camp memorial is called the Mittelbau-Dora Concentration Camp Memorial. And today it is a place of commemoration and learning. Visitors can walk through some of the tunnels, but they are pretty much full of rubble, and some of them are completely underwater. With the Allies poised at the gates of Germany, at the very borders, waiting to come in, a love story was playing out that would span over 70 years and across 2 continents. My parents married in November of 1944 in that little town called Havelbeck that was an oasis of peace. In the next 6 months, though, both Rolf and Ernst would be taken prisoner of war, and Lilo and her mother Gertrude would have to flee from the advancing Soviet troops more than once. And perhaps worst of all, neither Lilo nor Rolf would know for an entire year whether the other was still alive. A photo of Rolf while he was in Slovakia in between assignments Right after this photo was taken, though, he and tens of thousands of other German troops were sent to the front. In that last-ditch, desperate effort by the Nazi regime to turn the tide of the war. But once they arrived there were no weapons left to be given out. And with the war as good as over, Rolf and his unit were told to disperse. They understood what that meant. That meant desert, leave the front, walk homeward. And they did. Rolf walked 160 miles homeward in late winter, hoping against hope that there was still a home and a family to return to. And this, my friends, is one of the main differences between war fought on foreign soil and war fought on home soil, is that on home soil, not only military personnel are at risk, but homes and families as well. Between this photograph and the next, I'm doing a very sneaky thing. I am leaving out the most cathartic part of my family's story for you to read about in the book, how hope and dreams forged a dramatic reunion. And that was largely orchestrated by my mother's mother, Gertrude, my grandmother Gertrude, that mover and shaker in the family story. Post-war Bavaria, my favorite photograph of my parents, Rolf and Lilo. They are smiling down at someone or something, which I only found out what that was or who that was after I published my book. My older brother Ingo, at age 2, their post-war dream. By the time he was age 3, the post-war dream had grown a tail. That was due to the needlework of the same grandmother who made this dress. She decided to take one off her coat and put it onto his overalls. This is a great time for me to just talk a little about what it was like to be a child of German people. German people who were there during the war. My brother and I had a lot of questions about complicity and awareness. How much did they, our parents included, know about the Holocaust, about death camps? At first, for a long time, my opinion was they had to all have known. Such a vast phenomenon. Vast numbers of victims, perpetrators, camps, Hitler's venomous speeches. Over time, though, the more I read and researched, the more I came to realize that the truth is not quite so simple. True stories and real people aren't usually simple. There is complexity and paradox involved in all of it. And I came to find that even a lot of Jewish people who were in Germany during the war posing as non-Jews did not know that their entire families were wiped out until after the war. The Nazi regime, you see, never published accounts of the killings. Neither did Allied reports. But who did know? People in the upper echelons of the military, the government, hospitals and institutions, and many industries knew all of the gruesome facts. Many of them were supportive of the gruesome facts. But there were a lot of ordinary citizens who did not know. My parents, Rolf and Lilo, were shocked and horrified when they saw the post-war reports in Allied magazines and newspapers. It's possible that my grandfather Ernst might have known everything. After all, he worked not only at Mittelwerk, where there was that huge camp with inmates, but he also worked at Peenemünde for a while, where there was a smaller camp. Here's the thing, though. Those camps did not, by and large, hold Jews or people of other persecuted groups. They were mostly partisans and resistance fighters from the countries with which Germany was at war, who were held there. Yes, the conditions were terrible, and yes, my grandfather, being a major in the army, may have known more. I wish I could call Grandpa back and ask him these questions, but I can't. On my reading list, if you sign up, remember to sign up. There is a book entitled What We Knew by Johnson and Rubin, where they interviewed many people in Germany, outside Germany, people who had fled before the war, during the war, after the war, people who stayed, and they determined that about 1/3 of the population knew everything. About 1/3 heard rumors or suspected something but could not substantiate them, and 1/3 were completely in the dark. Yes, my family had survived an atrocious war. Every one of my family members survived. What were the odds of that? But Germany was a humanitarian disaster site, flooded with 14 million hungry, homeless, and desperate refugees. And not only they were hungry, everyone was starving in Germany. But perhaps the worst part for people like Rolf and Ernst and others was that the Soviet threat was still there. They were still perched on the borders of the Soviet Union and in danger of another takeover at any time. It was thanks to a group of very generous people in northern Indiana that my family was enabled to immigrate in late 1951. On a cold, foggy December day, middle of the month, my father Rolf, my mother Lilo, 8 months pregnant, and my older brother Ingo took their leave of Germany, and they traveled across a rubble-strewn countryside to arrive in Switzerland, only to find that their flight to America would be postponed due to the fog. But the next morning, on the brink of my family's odyssey to the New World, without even a sorry for the inconvenience, I emerged into the post-war old world. I completely disrupted their immigration plans by my premature arrival. They now had to raise more money. I couldn't even fly for free. But we did eventually arrive in Wakarusa, Indiana, idyllic little town of about 1,200 souls, where our kind, generous sponsors lived. My brothers and I, younger brother was born here in the States, the only natural-born citizen, are in the backyard of the first house that my father rented after he got his first job. We are eternally indebted to the people of Wakarusa. I donated a book to the library there right after it was published. I've traveled there 3 times and spoken not only in Wakarusa but other parts of Indiana. I will head back there again next year. They are the most wonderful, delightful, giving people that you could ever imagine. We are eternally indebted to Wakarusa. I dedicated my book not only to my parents, but also to the people of Wakarusa, Indiana. Remember my grandfather's dream? He wanted to be captain of a ship bound for America. Well, in 1952, in February, he and my grandmother Maria boarded a ship bound for America. No, he wasn't the captain of the ship, but for the first time in his adult life, he was no longer bound to the military of any regime. And as a result, I feel he became the captain of his own destiny. 1958, all except for my younger brother at lower left, we were all naturalized. We became citizens. It was a proud day indeed. At the back right, my mother's mother, Gertrude, that mover and shaker in the story. Right around this time, an amazing thing happened. My father, Rolf, and my grandfather, Ernst, were both hired by Chrysler Missile and Space Division near Detroit, where Rolf became head of a team that designed and built components of the Saturn IB rocket that were later used successfully in all of the Apollo moon missions. It's amazing that his dream was not only not devastated and totally destroyed by war and chaos, but it actually expanded to encompass the emerging U.S. space program, where he played a key role. After retirement, though, it's find a meaning time, but my father, Rolf, had already thought about it long before that. After retirement, his goal became to share his enthusiasm and his expertise with thousands of adults and children all over the Granite State. Here he is with a young astronauts program in Alton and with the Kensington Summer Camp in 2011. This spanned about 30 years. he dedicated really the latter part of his life to this. My parents' love story is as much about finding meaning, living a life of faith. For them, it was a life based on their Christian faith. And also it was about cherishing a dream. Cherishing a dream. It's much more about all of that than it was about surviving war. I encourage each of you to find that gem of meaning in your life that you can use to uplift and encourage others. In closing, this photograph from a 2013 rocket launch is a reminder that the dreams we share live on in the lives and memories of those we inspire. May our dreams today provide hope for a tomorrow where all people can live out their dreams and their purpose. Thank you.